Chris Lewicki is the president and CEO of Planetary Resources. Prior to that, he worked at NASA and was playing a key role in the life cycles of the Mars exploration rovers and the Phoenix Mars lander. Elizabeth Lopatto is the science editor at The Verge. She's previously written for Bloomberg News and Seed magazine. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Chris Lewicki and Liz Lopatto.
Hello.
Hello.
Glad you all could make it. So obviously, you say deep space mining, and a bunch of people perk up. And then that's even before you find out who's been involved.
Does more need to be said?
So maybe you can tell me a little bit about what the case is for space mining, because I know when people usually think about mining, they think about Earth. And,
yeah, absolutely. So we'll start with today is Yuri's night, or tonight is Yuri's night, April 12th, the 57th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin rocking it into space and orbiting the Earth for the very first time. And that gentleman happens to be a Russian, but it's really an international holiday to recognize that 1,000 years from now, we're not going to remember too many things about what were going on, but we're going to remember things like that. And steps like that are a part of doing what we do in space. And we've had 6 people on the International Space Station now for 18 years, continuously. We've had missions explore every planet in the solar system. And we've got companies going to Mars, going to the moon, going to asteroids. But mining in space is not quite what most people think it is. It won't first be about going to space to bring stuff back to Earth. It'll be like a good camping trip where you bring everything that you need with you, but that's not everything. And so mining in space is so that you don't have to bring everything with you. So that's the medium-length story.
Now, you guys, the first time I heard about you was 2012, and you had a very impressive roster of founding investors, some names that folks might know, Larry Page, Eric Schmidt, Richard Branson. What drew them to this proposition? I know you have a background from NASA. You spent a lot of time working on the Mars missions. What was the pitch you gave these folks?
It was a vision of a future that we could just start to see beginning. Elon Musk and the team at SpaceX had successfully launched the Falcon 1, and we're working on the Falcon 9. We had seen the Blue Origin team with what they were working on with New Shepard. We had seen companies like Robert Bigelow put habitats into space. And with a vision like Elon or Jeff Bezos have, with millions of people living and working in space, it was like, okay, well, the most important thing in space will be people, but people will need resources. So it was like, if we want to scale it to be millions of people living and working in space, now's a good time to get started on that.
Well, that makes sense. But it is pretty ambitious, right? I mean,
absolutely.
When you think about how Planetary Resources has evolved since 2012, which is not all that long ago.
No.
How have things changed for you since those sort of initial announcement?
Well, when we started the company almost 10 years ago and kept it super secret until we announced it in 2012, and then we ended up on the Daily Show. It's a great video with Jon Stewart, if people want to go out and look at that. But when we announced the company, it was a pretty crazy idea. It was like, is this legal? What are there things in space that you can mine? Who's going to need that? And what we've seen evolve over that time is we've built a lot of the technology. We just finished our latest mission in orbit with the Arctic 6. But we've seen things like financial services companies like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley come out and saying, well, this is going to be a big industry. The cost of building a mine in space is going to be about the same as building a mine on Earth. We've seen the United States pass laws to say if you go to space and you pick something up, you own it. Luxembourg has passed a law like that. And now, this year, we've got the Commerce Secretary talking about things like asteroid mining and space habitats. And it used to be science fiction, but it appears it's like slowly becoming reality.
That's sort of the way things have been going for most of the 20th century when it comes to space, I think.
Overnight success, 10 years in the making.
It seems like there are a bunch of technical challenges when it comes to mining an asteroid, not least of which is timing. How are you thinking about how to approach this? I mean, obviously, you know, maybe the first place to start is which asteroids are right for mining.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. In a lot of ways, Planetary Resources isn't a space company. It's a mining company operating in space. So we actually need to do all the same things that a mining company might do or an oil company might do. You have to figure out, you know, where to drill, where to dig. And you have thousands of options that you can do to do that, but you want to do the one that's going to be the most profitable, the project that you think that you can implement. And then once you've made that choice, you know, which oil well, which asteroid, well then you need to develop the technology and deploy that technology, and then you need to bring the product to market. So we're going through all the same steps that any normal mining company would go through. It's just the subject matter is a little bit different. So yeah, so it's what's old is new again, and the details are a little bit different.
Well, that makes sense. What kinds of things would we be mining? What's worth our time, and what's worth this kind of energy?
Well, there's lots of headlines about you know, precious metals and platinum and those type of things, and they're absolutely true. Those two things do exist on asteroids and the Moon and Mars in mind-bogglingly large quantities. But that's kind of the thing, like when everything is working really well and perfect, we'll be doing those things. To begin with, it's going to be some pretty simple stuff, and the most basic of things. The very first resource that we believe is going to be important is water. Water is pretty ordinary and boring. There's plenty of it out here on Earth, maybe not enough fresh water. But in space, it's really expensive to ship it there. It's heavy stuff. It costs tens of millions of dollars per ton to ship it out. But it's abundant on asteroids. We know that there's water in the poles of the Moon. We know that there's water on Mars. There's water in Pluto. It's all over the solar system. So it's a great example of something you don't need to bring with you. What's even more interesting about, we know why water is important for our biology. Water has two other unique applications in space. One is that it can protect you from the radiation environment in space. You know, little layer of water between you and the universe will keep you safe. But the most exciting thing is kind of how water really can be the fuel that can power space. It's a molecule of hydrogen and oxygen. And the Blue Origin's BE-4 engines operate on liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. The space shuttle main engines operated off of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Liquid oxygen is in every rocket on the planet.
Well, this is also why people get really excited about a moon base, right? Mm-hmm. Like there is a reserve of water that you could potentially tap into and then launch from the moon elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So it's for lack of a better word, it's about building gas stations. And you know, if you thought about California and say, well, where would be the best place to build a gas station? You know, you can only build one. We're of course going to have more than one, and you build them the places you need to go, on the way to the places that you're going to, and maybe the places that you're leaving. So we're actually going to have these, you could think of them as trading towns and supply shops where you can get everything you need to go on the next leg of your journey. Because in space, it's one place where you can't get out and walk. So you better be well stocked when you start on that trip.
Well, that makes sense. One of the things that you had mentioned earlier was that both the US and Luxembourg have made laws about who owns what in space and what you can bring back and what you can't. And I know that you've said in the past that policy is one of the big things that you think about when it comes to this kind of work. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you own things in space.
Well, absolutely. So 50 years ago, you know, there was concern about whether it was going to be a red moon or a red, white, and blue moon. As the superpowers were racing towards the moon landings in the 1960s. And we got together in 1967 and passed the Outer Space Treaty, and the Outer Space Treaty said things like, no sovereign nation shall lay claim to the moon or other celestial bodies. And that pretty much seemed like the last word. It's like, okay, well, you know, no one can claim anything, everyone owns it, you know, we can't do anything, which makes it difficult of like, well, how do you even get permission to go there then? Who's in charge? So what they wanted to make sure was like no one is like creating new territory, and we're not doing bad things to each other for that. They were specifically silent on the part of, well, what does it mean? You know, can a private citizen go out there? So a good analogy to think about this is when you get a fishing permit, or if you're a commercial fisherman and you go out in the ocean, you get a license to do that. Now, you don't own any fish when you get started doing that, and there are fish in the sea. But it isn't till the point where you've gotten your license, you've gone out in the ocean, you've put in your net, and you've brought them up on the ship. At that point, you own those fish. And if someone comes in on your boat and steals them, or if they cut your net, we have all kinds of laws that protect people from that. But that's kind of the concept of the legislation that's been introduced in these countries that says, okay, no one owns it right up until the point that you have your hands on it. And if you follow a certain set of rules, well, then we'll let you own it.
So we know that we have these resources in space. We know that we have some rules in place for how to deal with mining those resources. Sounds like the next big problem is technology. What kinds of steps do we need to take before we can begin to even do your first mining job?
Well, we've been very focused on technology related to space prospecting. It's a very antiquated term, but figuring out what's there, how much, grade, tonnage, and weight, if you're speaking about it in mining terms. And what's interesting about this, asteroids are actually a whole lot simpler than the Earth. The Earth is billions of years old. It's got plate tectonics and aqueous processes and pressure and temperature and time and just all kinds of complicated things that are going on, earthquakes. And we get all these minerals that form under super intense pressures. And this is what makes geology such a rich subject to study. But asteroids are kind of like the debris that's left over from forming all the planets, and they've just been out there doing nothing for 4 billion years. So they're pretty much the same stuff that they are when they started. And but we still have to figure out, okay, well, with, let's see which pocket I have it in tonight, somewhere on me.
This is what I look like when I'm searching for my phone.
Searching for my, no, oh, here it is. Way down. So this is a piece of a near-Earth asteroid, formerly known as the shooting star. So when you look up at night and see that trail of brightness, and I'll pass this around. I trust that the community tonight, this will find its way back to me. And if not, Vito is in the corner watching carefully. So we actually have samples of these things. That came from an asteroid not too long ago. So we know kind of from a taxonomy standpoint, like we know in the museum here tonight, we know that all these things exist on Earth. But it's like, with what's behind us here, we know that these things exist. Where did they come from? So that record we don't have. So that's what we're looking to create from a technology standpoint, is knowing where to start. But there's another thing that I'd like to probably completely disrupt people's perspective on asteroid mining and space travel and these things, is it's not going to be like you see in The Expanse, certainly, or pretty much any other sci-fi movie. We come from incredibly high-tech approaches to answer some of the most fundamental questions about life in the universe. And they're incredibly precise measurements, to figure out how old the Earth is, plus or minus, 1 million years, 4 billion years ago. Finding out how much water is in an asteroid is a pretty simple measurement. Is it 4% or 5% or 10%? It's a crude measurement. And when we go to mine asteroids, we're probably going to be doing it pretty low tech, I think, by most people's expectations. Think about this city 150 years ago and how people got here. It was in an iron horse, and they chopped down trees and they burned them to create steam, to expand a piston, to turn a wheel, to move it down the track. So in a lot of ways, that's how some of the stuff in space we're going to start with. It's going to be very simple things where we'll create a lot of water on the asteroid and we'll lose most of it in space. We'll create a little bit of a comet. But we'll catch just enough of it to be able to deliver it to a customer and serve a need and figure out how to do a little bit better next time. And just like we've gone from the steam engines to the Hyperloop, we'll go from asteroid mine 1 to asteroid mining infinity, and we'll be much better at it as we go along.
So we've only really landed on a handful of asteroids.
It's a lot more than 0, which it was 15 years ago.
It's true. It's better than 0, but it's still pretty rare. There's Japan's Hayabusa mission and the OSIRIS-REx mission, which is still ongoing. What have we learned from this that might inform what you're doing?
Oh, so this is the wonderful thing, is we have known about asteroids for about 200 years. We've had these meteorites to tell us kind of what they're made of. One of the missions I worked in college was the Near Shoemaker mission, which went to the very first near-Earth asteroid ever discovered, 433 Eros. And that was actually the first one to land. Wasn't designed to do it, but they set it down at the end on Eros. Just 6 years later, the first Hayabusa mission actually went to the asteroid Itokawa. It looks like a little sea otter. It actually landed on it a couple times and brought back tiny, tiny amounts that we've studied in laboratories. And really what we've learned is a number of things. We've confirmed a lot of things that we suspected were true. But I think we also were very, very surprised. One of the things with the first Japanese mission was we learned that something that is as big as this museum, they were thinking, well, it can't possibly have enough gravity to be anything other than a rock. Because if it had a grain of sand on that, the grain of sand would just, if something impacted it, it would just float into space. But in that mission, they learned, well, it's got all sorts of rubble pile, and it's got like boulders sticking out of it the size of skyscrapers, like pointing off in one direction. And from an asteroid mining standpoint, it's like almost someone, like Mother Nature took a cosmic sifter, and it sifted all like the fines down to the middle of the asteroid and left all the big bits on the edge. So if you've got technology that's good with the big stuff, go to the edges. If you've got technology that you don't want to crush everything, well, go to the middle. I think it's the thing, having worked in NASA and supported these missions, every time we go out and explore the universe, we confirm something that we were looking for, and then we discovered something that we weren't looking for, which makes us ask more questions.
Yeah, the thing you didn't know, you didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really very ambitious, and there was a period where the space shuttle was being retired, like right around 2011, where it seemed like our future in space might be limited. Now this was around the time that you guys were starting up.
Right during the financial crisis, too.
Yeah,
Great
best time to start a space company is when everything's going wrong on Earth. So I guess one of the things that I find myself really curious about is, how have things changed in the last decade, and how we're thinking about space, and how we're thinking about what our ambitions there might be?
Well, 10 years ago, I think the prevailing opinion from most people, maybe not people in this room, is that there's no way that some private company can go out and make a rocket and do it better than everyone who's doing it, and you certainly can't reuse rockets. They've always been disposable, and everyone just knew that was true. Except for a few people working at a couple companies. And now it is like so routine, it's not quite boring yet, but like the show is when the booster comes back. Who cares when it went into space? That's the yawn-inducing part.
Yeah, SpaceX is like running out of storage space for their boosters. They've been so successful at it.
Yeah, so now we don't have a used rocket, we have a flight-proven rocket. Because who would want to go in a rocket that's never been demonstrated to work before? So there's things like that where people realize that, oh, well, actually, maybe this is, like, this part of the space economy probably could be done by a private company. And NASA did a great introduction of a contract where they said, okay, well, we'll let private companies bid on sending cargo to the space station. And this is something that Elon very famously said kind of saved SpaceX. In the Christmas miracle, where they were about to run out of money, but they got this contract, and they've been doing a great service for NASA, and NASA's been getting a great deal out of that because they pay a lot less than they were paying for space shuttles to get the cargo there.
Well, also it's cheaper even than ULA. I mean, the United Launch Alliance, for those of you who don't know, was the only real carrier for a while, and now they have competition, which is probably good.
Yeah, so we have options so that rockets do blow up from time to time, and they will continue to blow up. Cars are still crashing, and we've been driving them for 100 years now, and airplanes do still occasionally fall out of the sky. But it's the type of thing where when we would experience a problem like that in space, everything would shut down. And it would be like a crisis because we didn't have like option B. But now we've got a couple options for doing that. And this year or next, we're going to see private companies start to take people to the space station so that we're not relying on Russia to do that. So this is like one little foothold of, okay, well, this is actually a way that public institutions and private entities can work together for doing this. And we're starting to see this in other parts. We've gotten, music and television from space, and we're soon going to have lots of internet from space, with many companies competing to do that. We have companies in town like Planet who are providing commercial imagery of every spot on the Earth every day. So a lot of it is, just like you can go and look at the Computer History Museum with all these different idea of like, what does a personal computer look like, evolved over time. And what we're seeing right now is, what does commercial activity in space look like? And we're seeing lots of experiments being done. And that's been enabled because we can make satellites smaller. And because they're smaller, they're cheaper to put into space. And even high schools are launching satellites into space now.
The joys of the CubeSat, the tiny little satellite. One of the other things that seems to have changed, especially from the original space race, is that individuals are more important in space than they've ever been. So you see these people like Richard Branson, for instance, or Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos, all of whom are playing a role in financing what is a very, very expensive industry and what has traditionally been done by government. How has that altered it?
Well, I think it's altered it in a lot of ways. We've seen throughout history, the great telescopes of the world. Lick Observatory nearby here wasn't funded by a government. It was funded by a wealthy private individual. You can think of that as 19th century space exploration, brought to you by a private benefactor. And we're seeing that again with the people who are really funding their passions. Jeff Bezos, his son, said he's taking his lottery ticket at Amazon and cashing it in and investing it in his space company. And in certain ways, that for those big capital-intensive long-term projects, it probably is still necessary. Because the venture capitalists in the Bay Area, it's a little bit beyond both the size of the checks that they write, and it's also a little bit beyond the timeline of investments that their investors will let them make. So, and but we're seeing it become a little bit more accessible. So, it could be that in another 10 years, we'll see more and more things kind of fall outside of the wealthy benefactor into private entities. And we're seeing more and more private space companies that are getting venture capital or crowd financing, or perhaps the best yet with the speaker who's coming up next, where you don't need much investment because you have customers. So it's really just ordinary business models in extraordinary locations.
Just ordinary business in space, that's all. Nothing to worry about. So obviously this is a really, really different model than what we're used to with NASA, and you've worked within NASA, so you are very familiar. How would you characterize the difference between the sort of new space industry versus what NASA's model is?
So NASA really has enabled all this. 50 years of technology development and space exploration. They've provided the map. They've provided lots of pages and to tell us kind of what's possible, how to do things, how not to do things. And they'll continue to do that, for the things that aren't economic. I don't see the economic exploration of Pluto happening soon. But perhaps the economic exploration of the moon is going to happen, in the next 5 to 10 years, as well as asteroids and Mars. There's a kind of a mindset of failure is not an option, and certainly when there's people on board, that's a good point of view. But if it gets too pervasive, when failure is not an option, success gets really expensive. And I think what we're seeing is people trying to figure out how to be a little bit less than perfect when they're doing the space businesses, so that rockets can blow up and the company doesn't go out of business, or maybe the booster doesn't always come back, or maybe 2 out of the 9 engines stop working. So it's looking for ways that it doesn't have to be the most perfect, high-performing, best thing ever invented. It just has to get the job done. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of cases, it's something that is designed to be efficient instead of being designed to be the best. So, like Southwest Airlines can turn their plane around in 10 minutes and get you in your seat, SpaceX and Blue Origin want to turn their rockets around just as fast and put a new payload on top of that. And you can't do that the way that NASA designed the space shuttle to be launched. But you probably can do that the way that they're designing the Falcon 9 and the New Glenn to be launched.
So, I mean, obviously NASA's been a huge part of all of this. Do you see yourself working with NASA in the future, and if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. So, they have the largest budget for space in the world. Certainly, I think in a lot of cases there's partnerships, potentially, customer relationships there. When we go out and execute our resource exploration mission on asteroids, we will double the data set about near-Earth asteroids that exists for humanity. So, and we'll do it for 3 cents on the dollar for what NASA costs to do that. So to be able to, provide some of this data for scientific things, certainly, like you said, when you have 3 data points, getting 6 data points or 12 data points is a lot more
data. It's pretty big.
Yeah, it's pretty big. So that's something that, maybe we can't pay for the whole project, by selling some of that information to NASA, but it's kind of, you think about it of a mall. You have your anchor tenants and all those other stores, and NASA in a lot of ways is kind of like the anchor tenant. They don't keep the mall in business, but they're kind of important to be there.
How do you plan to appeal to NASA in order to get their sign-off on some of this work?
I think a lot of it is just showing how what we've learned. Maybe I'll say, approach this from a different thing. One of the reasons why I left NASA to go into the private sector is I saw that a lot of the most interesting innovation in technology was happening in consumer electronics and computing and software and like all these things that have nothing to do with space. So what's enabling a lot of this really exciting technology and applications in space are the exact same things that billions of dollars of investment went into your cell phone to create. So I think a lot of this is showing, NASA, like, here's a way where we can get better science, or we can have, instead of just having 6 people on the International Space Station, here's how we can have 60 people in space. And find a way that, that science and commerce and sport and all those things, like Jeff Bezos talks about millions of people living and working in space. I think he left out living, working, and playing in space. But it's like it's all part of the human condition, and I think that's what's so exciting. Having more people contributing is we're doing all this because to a certain extent we want to go there, and we want to do all the things that we enjoy doing.
Well, one of the things that I think is really crucial in terms of not only thinking about how to explore space, but even what kinds of technology we want to use to do it, is just having a certain amount of imagination, right? Like you have to dream it up before you can build it. So I guess one of the things that I think might be helpful is perhaps if you were to talk about what inspired you to get involved with NASA, with engineering, with all of this in the first place. So
I probably picked my career path when the Voyager 2 spacecraft flew past its last planet in 1989, Uranus. And, we went from this kind of greenish blue little dot there out on the edge of the solar system. That's all it ever was a pixel. And then all of a sudden it was this place. And it had clouds and it had moons. And, then they later found that it had a little ring around it. And it was like, discovery, where something that was unknown became known. And it was like an immense joy to see New Horizons go past Pluto and see that happen again for a new generation of, here's Pluto, the most powerful telescope ever created. The Hubble Space Telescope, it's still like 4 pixels across. But now, it's got ice mountains and geysers and in places that we're starting to name.
That little heart.
Yeah.
What would you hope to inspire people to do with planetary resources? What would you hope to inspire the next generation with, if possible?
I think a lot of it is just realizing that it doesn't happen overnight, but it's sooner than 100 years from now. And the way that I like to think about it is kind of in generations. And you're born, you go through school, you find your spouse, and you have kids, about 30 years. So it's, on average, a generation. So we went from the internal combustion engine and the invention of flight to, with Henry Ford, like a lot of people owning cars in one generation. Like all of a sudden, all the horses went away. That was one generation. And around the same time, we went from the first time that we had lighter-than-air flight to fighting wars with it, and in World War I, and delivering the mail. in one generation. You went from this brand new technology that used to be just birds, and now you're delivering postal mail. And from that, we went to the DC-3 and the jet age, which now you could go from continent to continent in just one day, and you didn't have to take a steamship. And we went from there to landing on the moon. And then, we went from computers being, there's a market for as many as 8 of them around the entire world, to a generation from that, the personal computer. And a generation from that, or being a computer in everyone's pocket and wrist. And so I've just described 4 generations and all that magical stuff that's happened. So, like, 4 generations from now is kind of beyond imagination in terms of all the things that are going to be happening. So, my mindset has been with space exploration. I think within 10 years, everyone in this room will know someone personally who has been to space. And maybe they went into orbit, maybe they took one of the suborbital tours, but they will have seen the edge of the Earth, the blackness of space, and the countries and states without border, and 6 minutes of zero gravity, and all that wonderful stuff. I think within a generation, you'll hear stories about people who went either to the space station or that spot on the moon and vacationed. And it was the most expensive vacation they ever took in their entire life, and they had to mortgage their house to do it. But they did it. So the thing is that that's kind of like what it was like going from Wilbur and Orville Wright to like flying on the DC-3. It wasn't something that like everybody did or most people could afford, but you could see it happening. You'd read about it, in the media. So I think we're about a generation away from that, and all it takes is people to just set their minds to it and to make it happen.
Do you ever get people who say, well, maybe this isn't the best way for us to be focusing our resources, or this isn't something that we should necessarily be doing? What do you say to those people?
Yeah, so it's the whole idea of like, well, we've messed up the Earth enough already, let's not go into space and do that too. I am definitely, I agree with Jeff Bezos that we've explored all the planets in the solar system. This is definitely the best one. And we should take care of it. And in a lot of ways, our understanding about how fragile our environment came to us from the space program. When Bill Anders and Apollo 8 rounded the moon and got that beautiful picture of Earthrise, it was the first time we realized, like, there we all are. And then, Voyager 2 later turned its cameras back on Earth, and we got Carl Sagan and in my opinion, some of the most beautiful words ever written in the English language, the story about the pale blue dot, and how everything we've ever known, every sinner, every saint, it's all right there in that pixel, suspended in a mode of light and a sunbeam. But I think, the idea that there's too much of us and there's not enough of everything else is a closed mindset. And by going into space, we actually can kind of increase the amount of things that we have access. We have an opportunity to, do it even better this time. Probably going to make some mistakes. But by exploring space, we don't have to figure out how small our family should be, or, how few things we should use, or, it's like the sky is, not been the limit for a very long time. But I look forward to the anxious discussions of should we leave the solar system, because this one's pretty good, and we got spread out amongst it, and it's just too far away to Alpha Centauri. So, we don't want to bring all the problems of Sol to Alpha Cent B. But I think, this really is getting to our greatest potential by just continuing what we do, is to just explore boundaries and exceed them.
So it sounds like you're very interested in putting humans in space, and not necessarily doing the sort of robotic exploration that has been sort of very important to NASA over the last 15 years or so, especially as we've gotten better and better at having unmanned aerial vehicles, other kinds of drones, those sorts of things. Why people?
Because. Why do anything? Why raise a family? Why go to the movies? Why create art? Why appreciate beauty? Why have a career? The whole aspect of, it's not going to be all 7 billion of us or 10 billion of us that are going to leave the planet and in one big rush and leave it behind, but there will be some percentage of people who will always want to go over that hill. And I'm a robot guy. I've been involved in the Mars rovers and landers, and in a lot of ways, robots allow us to extend our human senses. and we can see through the eyes of a rover driving around on Mars and kind of share its experience. But robots ultimately all they're doing is they're paving the way for people to follow them. And we did this landing on the moon. We sent a lot of robots to the moon before we sent Neil and Buzz. And we're sending a lot of robots to Mars before anyone's going to go there. And it's going to be the same thing with every other place we go.
So you see a future where somebody puts down on their tax forms that they are, in fact, a space miner.
I do that now.
So this isn't the future. This exists already.
Yeah.
What jobs do you think people will have in space, particularly if they are working, for instance, on asteroid mining?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of cliche to say, the jobs we'll have in the future, we don't even know what the names of them are. That'll certainly be true. But a lot of the jobs that people will have will be familiar. I have this idea where I think the coolest job, probably in the next 15 years, is going to be the hotel staff at the space hotel. And it's because, you're going to have all these very wealthy people or, astronauts who are going to go up there for their 2, 3, 4 weeks, but, they have to go home. You live there. And, certainly, you've got to, bring them martini and everything and clean up after their messes and keep all the systems going. But think about, like, what you do after work in the space hotel. I think that's the best maid job, the best janitor job, the best bellman job you could possibly have. So that's a very ordinary job in a very extraordinary location.
So you're seeing like space bums the way that we have ski bums now, is that right?
Could be.
Yeah, okay.
I think a lot of the jobs will be related to maintenance and infrastructure, just keeping the machines running. There's, lots of stuff, this all in science fiction. We have to recycle our air systems, recycle our water, grow food. We're going to have farmers in space who are going to have to tend after the various things that we're going to grow, whether it's plant matter or synthetic meats or whatever they might be going to be. It's going to again be in a different location, but a lot of the jobs will be familiar. And then we're going to have probably a lot of more space weather forecasters and jobs that we can't imagine. But the thing that I think is most exciting is, like, it is so difficult to get something out into space right now that we put billions and billions of dollars and decades into doing that. But Steve Squires, who is the principal investigator of Spirit and Opportunity, we talked about Spirit's first 90 days, first year, our Opportunity's 14 years on Mars. Opportunity's primary mission, the first 90 days, Steve Squires always said, a good grad student could do that in an afternoon. And its whole prime mission you could do in a week. So, like, the robot's pretty inefficient, but think about the science and the discovery we'll be able to do when they're actually, curious human beings that can adapt to change and have opposable thumbs and, won't stop working when their boss tells them not to.
Well, speaking of curious human beings with questions and opposable thumbs, I think it is time for me to open up the Q&A for the audience. I'm going to ask that you raise your hands. We'll get you a mic. There's a mic coming around. So, who's got questions?
Hi. I was curious about your opinion on when we get to the point of, speculation, when we get to the point of when we are starting to cultivate more in space, how will our cultures be able to come together in this within the various countries that we have and various programs happening all at the same time? Is it going to be something that we're going to be able to all connect with, or will be all subdivided in space?
Yeah, so this is something, I guess, that is both worrisome and exciting, depending on your outlook on life. The International Space Station is kind of an interesting example where we've got a lot of different countries, and they even had to come up with an international agreement of what to do if if something bad happens on the space station. Like, what if a crime is committed, murder on the space station. But they had to look like, well, how is this going to work? It's not inside any territory. Who's in charge? If it happened in the Russian module, is it a Russian thing? If it happened in the Japanese module, is it a Japanese thing? and like a lot of things where we have changed our environment, we like have to figure it out. You know, for the past, you know, the history of humanity back to the things that are on the other side of the exhibit over here with early man, we used to figure those things out by fighting with each other. But now we're figuring these things out in a lot of ways in economic reasons. It's, you know, when there's a financial incentive involved lately, it's much easier to respond to the, you know, the financial pain or the financial opportunity than it is to have a fight about it. But the other thing too is we've got many models of like how to do things about this, and it's not going to happen quickly. So I think you know, whether it is the different things that have talking about taking groups of people to Mars or setting up new nations in outer space, this is one of the big things that we're going to have to figure out. The thing that I'm optimistic about it was like, it would be like saying in, you know, the late 80s and early 90s of, we can't have the internet yet, we haven't figured out how to tax it. So the law and policy will catch up with the progress at an appropriate pace.
Sounds like we're going to need some space anthropologists.
Yeah, and space accountants too.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned both the idea of like exploding water and catching kind of as much of it as you can, and then you also mentioned the gas station story, and that seems to span like just resources and then also kind of distribution and almost infrastructure. In terms of like the history, or excuse me, the future of where solar colonies will go, where do you see planetary resources being in terms of just crates of resources or infrastructure and distribution and things like that?
Well, our vision is one of resources and to be a resource provider. In a lot of ways, it's kind of driven by the gold rush. You know, it's Levi's made all the money in that, as it turns out. But you know, providing the picks and shovels, it's the thing that we could think of that enables every other activity in space. Certainly, getting from the surface of the Earth into space is an essential link in that chain. But everything else can scale without limit once you have the material to do things. So whether it is providing the raw stock for 3D printers to print out O'Neillian colonies to put people in space, or creating energy sources through the manufacturing of semiconductors, or fuel or oxidizer, or bringing stuff back to the Earth, it's just kind of being part of that commodity supply chain, and that's a big enough focus for us.
Hi. I'm just curious if you know what the chunk of asteroid, like what it's made of.
Yes. So the iron meteorite that I'm passing around the room is mostly iron, 90% iron, about 8% nickel, about 1% cobalt, and about 200 times more platinum group metals than the most productive mine on Earth. But before you get too excited about that, it's 200 parts per million. So when you looked at that, what was interesting about it, you noticed that cross-hatch pattern named after a German scientist, and it's called Wittgenstein pattern. And the reason why you know that this is not of this Earth is because of that pattern. This is two different alloys of iron and nickel that have different specific gravities. So if you were a metallurgist on Earth and you had melted these two different alloys and then done a cross-section and etched it, the heavy stuff would be on the bottom, the top stuff would be on the top, and they would be separated by one line. It would be very boring to look at. But in space, there is no bottom and there is no top. So you have this very complex octahedrite pattern that forms. So this is, it's very pretty, but it's kind of one of the unique things about this and why I always kind of carry it with me. But this is, refinery grade space age steel, and the NCC 1701 and the Millennium Falcon aren't going to be built out of exotic space age materials. They're going to be built out of asteroid iron and nickel.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Right. Kind of along similar lines, you spoke a lot about prospecting in space, but on Earth that's connected to a long and complicated processing supply chain. Mm-hmm. Have you thought about what a space refinery is going to look like? Like what that architecture is going to be?
In great detail. And it's every bit as complicated as it on Earth. Some of it, the prospecting is a bit easier because instead of having, the surface of the Earth and overburden different layers and all these type of things, if you go out to the astronomy exhibits here tonight, it's just you and the asteroid and nothing between you and it, but millions of kilometers of empty space. So what you see is what you get, and we can use telescopic spectroscopy to really get a really good first idea. And we've gone from the 750,000 or so asteroids in the solar system to about 70 that we're interested in. But the supply chain, this is one of the most interesting things that we found is that there is no best place, and they're all trades. So if you want resources for your moon base, the best place to get them is the surface of the moon. If you want resources in low Earth orbit, it's kind of a tie between bringing it in from deep space versus bringing it up from low Earth orbit. If you want resources for your geostationary satellite, definitely get them from an asteroid. And if you want resources on the way to Mars, asteroids are good too. But it all kind of depends, again, what NASA does, where they're going to build their space station, what SpaceX's progress is going to be, the 3 different companies that are building space stations, where they decide to put them. So it's like when John D. Rockefeller, started Standard Oil, it would be like asking, well, where are going to be the locations of all the gas stations? And it kind of depends, where they build the roadside stop and where the restaurant's going in and where people decide to build up homes. So what is, I would say, one advantage in space as we do this is rather than just random human musings of like, let's build a casino in the middle of the desert, as one thing, the laws of physics kind of weigh heavily on your options. So you can have a pretty narrow prediction on where things are going to happen, and this is where we've seen human activity in space so far.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you all very much for coming. We will be back in a couple of minutes, and we're just going to take a quick break, and then we will be here again.
All right. Thanks a lot.